I'm tired of always being the strong one, the one who gets everything done. Today, I just want someone to look at me and ask nothing of me. This audiobook isn't here to teach you anything. I'm not coming with advice, and I won't tell you that in the end everything will be all right. I sit down beside you. I tell you how it hurts when you've carried everything for too long. I speak to you unfiltered, just like you do when you've run out of strength to explain yourself. Don't expect solutions here. What you'll find is truth. And if you've ever felt alone, right in the middle of it all, then this space is for you too. Chapter 1. The Trap of the Strong Woman. They always said I was strong, even as a child, as if I'd been born wearing armor, as if it didn't hurt to carry it. I remember hearing that word so many times, strong, as a compliment, like a medal I should hang around my neck, even when it crushed me inside. They said it when I stayed silent while everything around me fell apart. When I didn't cry at funerals. When I held on, swallowed my words, forced a smile so as not to burden anyone. They said it with admiration, yes, but also with an unspoken expectation hidden behind the praise. Because once you're labeled the strong woman, you can't shed it without disappointing someone. I was strong so I wouldn't be a burden. To be the dutiful daughter who never causes trouble, the partner who never demands, the friend who always listens but never needs anything. I was strong to survive in a world where sensitivity is weakness, where vulnerability is a luxury I couldn't afford. I learned to need nothing, ask for nothing, never appear small or fragile, and at first it seemed like an advantage. I believed it made me free, but over time I realized it wasn't freedom. It was loneliness. Being strong meant no one worried. If I functioned, went to work, cooked, laughed, listened when others broke down, then I must be okay, right? And that's exactly when the trap snaps shut. Because when you show you can handle it all, everyone else leans back, and you're left alone, truly alone. Part of me got used to expecting nothing, not out of pride, out of exhaustion. Because every time I showed weakness, I felt everyone's discomfort. They didn't know how to handle it. My pain spoiled the image they had of me. So I shut down. I swallowed my doubts, my anger, my fear. I swallowed everything, quietly, head held high. I told myself, I can get through this too. But I couldn't. It hurt to be the one consoling others while I fell apart inside. It hurt to listen with no one to confide in. It hurt to be surrounded by people who loved me but didn't really see me. And it wasn't their fault. I had learned to hide well, to look strong even as I crumbled within. At some point, strength was no longer a tool but a role that earned applause, but slowly destroyed me inside. Because there was no room for mistakes, for tears, for being overwhelmed. When I was tired, I kept going. When it was too much, I said, I'm fine. When I needed to cry, I did it in secret, at night, my face buried in the pillow so no one would hear. That was my emotional routine. Hide, endure, function. And the hardest part was, the stronger I appeared, the less compassion I received. As if strength automatically meant I needed nothing. As if I had no right to comfort, tenderness, a hug. As if that strength were a punishment disguised as a virtue. Sometimes people ask why I said nothing, why I didn't ask for help, why I didn't let go sooner. The answer is brutally simple. I didn't know how. I'd never learned that I could. Because every time I tried, I felt rejection, misunderstanding, or silence. They admired my strength, but when I broke down, no one wanted to see it. Being strong shouldn't mean forsaking your humanity, but that's exactly what happened. I became the support for everyone else and forgot myself in the process. Or worse, I learned to ignore myself so I wouldn't burden anyone. I became that woman who is always there, who always gives, who handles everything. And no one demanded it outright. But once everyone's used to your resilience, any sign of weakness feels like betrayal. I'm not angry at the people around me. I'm angry at myself. For holding on so long when I was already exhausted. For confusing strength with duty. For so often remaining silent, out of fear of losing my place. The place of the unshakable, the dependable, the strong. The worst part was realizing I'd lost parts of myself along the way. Because it wasn't just about looking strong for others. I began to judge myself. I expected myself always to endure, always to function. And every time I failed, I blamed myself. I told myself I had no right to be weak, that others had it worse, that I should just keep going. Until I couldn't anymore. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, no loud crash, more like a silent fading. I withdrew, stopped answering. No more polite laughter. I stopped feigning enthusiasm when I felt only emptiness. I simply stopped lying. And in that silence, in that surrender, I found a small, genuine spark. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel what I truly felt. And paradoxically, that was the strongest moment of my life. The trap of the strong woman isn't just the image others have of you. It's what you believe about yourself, that you need no help, that you must always function, that you must never break, and escaping it is hard. It means admitting you're tired, that you're sad, that you want something different, not more recognition, not more admiration, but finally to be seen, completely, not just as strong. I didn't come into this world to endure everything. I'm here to feel, to live, to be real, with all my parts, the strong and the fragile, the ones that hold, and the ones that let go. And it was time to stop pretending otherwise. Chapter 2. The exhaustion you can't see. There's an exhaustion that doesn't show in dark circles, doesn't reveal itself through yawns, and isn't admitted with a tired, "I'm a bit worn out," at breakfast. It's another kind of tiredness, deeper, more persistent, one that sleep alone can't cure. It sits in your chest, sometimes in your back, often in your thoughts, spreading slowly like a fog that at first goes unnoticed, but eventually envelops everything. I could get up in the morning, shower, get ready, make all my appointments, smile at people, even crack jokes, and still feel utterly empty. Not because I hadn't slept enough, not because my body was failing, but because something inside me had gone quiet. And not the peaceful kind of quiet that brings rest, but the other, the weary, resigned, lifeless quiet that expects nothing. I functioned, yes, but I wasn't truly there. That was when I began to lose myself without even realizing it. I kept going because stopping wasn't an option, because everyone else kept going, because I thought it was normal. And eventually, I truly believed that this leaden feeling was part of life, that one simply lives that way, always a bit overwhelmed, a bit exhausted, a bit annoyed, but strong, resilient, reliable. But it wasn't normal. I remember evenings when I came home to a silent apartment, and instead of relaxing, an unsettling restlessness overtook me. I couldn't feel myself anymore. I sat there, surrounded by things I'd chosen, and yet everything felt alien. I was too tired to cry, too drained to explain myself. I just wanted to disappear for a moment, away from conversations, expectations, the daily little things that lay on my shoulders like weights. And still I never spoke of it. Because how do you explain this kind of exhaustion when on the outside you're functioning? When you do your job, fulfill your duties, have no visible problems. I had food in the fridge, a roof over my head, a handful of people who cared about me. So I had to be grateful. Right? That's what I told myself. That's what I'd been taught. Complaining is weakness. Pushing through is strength. And suddenly I was back in the role I was trying to break free from. It's hard to admit you're falling apart inside when everything else carries on. And it's even harder to talk about because few people truly listen. Most only listen as long as you don't push them out of their comfort zone. When you say, "I can't anymore," they usually want to hear, "But I'll manage anyway." Because that's the story people love. The hero who's tired but keeps fighting. What few can handle is the one who simply lets go. Who says, "I don't want to fight anymore." And that was exactly my state. I wasn't just tired. I was war-weary, of constant functioning, of contorting myself, of silent endurance. I was tired of appearing strong when inside I ached for softness. Tired of conversations where I always showed understanding but was barely understood myself. Tired of the expectation to have everything under control while inside I had already fallen to pieces. This invisible exhaustion can't be measured. No doctor instantly diagnoses it. It doesn't show on x-rays or blood tests, but it eats you up, slowly, relentlessly, and it dulls you. Not all at once, but gradually. First a bit irritated, then impatient, later resigned, and eventually you don't care about anything. Not out of apathy, but because you simply have no strength left to care. Not for others, not for yourself. I remember often sitting in the car, in a parking lot or between appointments, staring into space. I wanted nothing. Didn't want to move forward or backward. I just didn't want to have to anymore. Not to function, not to perform, not to prove myself. I wanted for a moment to just exist, without anything being expected of me. And then I realized I couldn't go on like that. But I also didn't know how to stop. Because who am I if I'm not the one who manages everything? Who am I if I'm not strong anymore? If I don't offer a friendly smile? If I say no? If I'm not there for others? I had defined myself so much by achievement, strength, and endurance that I no longer knew how life looked outside that role. This invisible exhaustion forces you to rediscover yourself. It confronts you with the question of whether you really want to live this way, or if you simply don't know an alternative. And it doesn't shout. It whispers. It drains your energy so slowly you barely notice you're running on autopilot. And the fatal part is, you can keep this up for months, maybe even years, until one day you wake up, physically healthy, emotionally empty, and no longer know where you are. I never received a burnout diagnosis. No drama, no ambulance or panic attack. Just a permanent inner tiredness that stole my joy. The colors of life faded. Even things I once loved felt like obligations. It wasn't a big catastrophe that changed me. It was this slow fading. It took me a long time to even recognize it as exhaustion, and even longer to understand I wasn't at fault. That it isn't my fault when I can't anymore. That pausing isn't failure. It's an act of self-respect. A quiet rebellion against a system, inside me and around me, that only valued me when I performed. Today, I know. I'm allowed to be tired. I'm allowed to say I can't anymore. And I'm allowed to build a life where that isn't weakness, but humanity. This exhaustion you can't see is perhaps the deadliest of all. But it's also the first sign that something wants to change. And if you truly listen, really listen, then it can be a breakthrough, not a breakdown. Chapter 3. When I'm fine becomes a reflex. It crept in slowly, almost unnoticed. At first, it was still a choice, a conscious response to the question, "How are you?" I'd weigh the situation, consider whether I had the space to answer honestly, wonder if the other person really wanted to hear what was happening inside me, or if it was just a polite formula. And almost always I chose the obvious. I'm fine. Short, simple, unremarkable. No one asked further. Everyone was satisfied. Over time, it stopped being a choice and became a reflex. The words came faster than the thought, like an automatic defense mechanism. Even in moments when I was burning inside, I said it. Even when my heart raced, my mind whirled, even when I wanted nothing more than to cry, I still said, "I'm fine." And no one noticed the contradiction, not even me at first. I had learned that honesty sometimes makes people uncomfortable, that it's easier to present everything as smooth and stable. Not because I liked lying, but because I couldn't bear to explain myself, because I was too tired to put my inner world into coherent sentences, only to receive an awkward nod or an unwanted piece of advice. So I played along. I maintained my facade, even though it was already cracked. I said fine when I was exhausted. I said fine when I was sad. I said fine, even when I felt everything slipping away. I didn't say it out of strength. I said it out of habit, out of convenience, out of self-protection. It was like a coat I threw over my truth so no one would see it, and so I wouldn't have to feel it. Because when you say, "I'm fine," too often, you eventually start believing it yourself. Not because it's true, but because you no longer know what it feels like to be honest. I began to ignore my own signals. I felt something was off, but I pushed it away. I told myself it was just a phase, that others had it worse, that I should pull myself together. And every time I said that, I choked a little more. I functioned. I met expectations. I laughed at the right moments. I nodded when someone spoke. I asked how others were. I listened. I was present. But inside I was gone. I was somewhere else, in a room I'd locked because I didn't know how to enter it anymore. There was so much piled up: frustration, disappointment, fatigue, emptiness, feelings for which I no longer had words. And because I didn't know how to express them, I silenced them. One day someone, a friend with whom I'd always been open, asked me how I really was, and I automatically said, "All good." She looked at me quietly and said, "You don't have to be strong." And that sentence hit me harder than any accusation, because I'd forgotten that it's allowed to be honest, that I don't always have to keep up appearances, that I don't have to save everyone, especially not at the expense of my own truth. But the reflex was stronger. Even once I knew I wasn't fine, I struggled to say it. I was afraid that if I started, it would never stop, that I'd lose myself in my own chaos, and that no one would be there to hold it. Because we say fine so often because we've learned the world is overwhelmed by truth. Because we know most people want simple answers, clear lines, no complexity, no emotional depth. Just a quick check-in, a brief, everything's green, and on to the next task, the next conversation, the next shallow exchange. But eventually the body begins to speak the truth. Not with words, but with symptoms. Sleep problems, headaches, irritability, listlessness. All those "I'm okay" phrases manifest in cells, muscles, breath. And then you stand in front of the mirror, hardly recognizing yourself, because you haven't looked long enough, because you stopped believing yourself. I had to learn to listen again, to the quiet tones, to the little signs, to the ache in my chest when I lie to myself, to the hollow feeling in my stomach when I force a smile, to the dull echo inside when I've once again overridden my needs. And that wasn't easy. It was uncomfortable because I had to face things I'd repressed for years. But it was necessary, urgent, saving. Honesty isn't a loud act. It begins in small moments. When you pause before answering, "How are you?" When you allow yourself not to be strong right away. When you say, "I don't know right now," or "Not great," or simply, "I'm tired." It sounds banal, but it changes everything. Because each time I acted from awareness instead of reflex, I felt a little more like myself. Imperfect, but honest. And that was worth more than any perfect facade. It meant taking myself seriously again, not betraying myself just to maintain an image, either the image others had of me or the one I'd convinced myself of. Even now, I sometimes feel that reflex, that automatic "I'm fine" on my tongue before I even think. But I notice it, I recognize it, and I breathe. Sometimes I still lie, sometimes I don't. But the difference is, I choose consciously again. I'm with myself again. And that's the beginning of something deeper than mere strength. It's what makes me feel alive. Because if we keep overriding ourselves, we lose not only connection to others but to ourselves. And eventually that reflex becomes a wall. And behind that wall, it becomes too quiet. Too quiet. That's why it's not about telling everything. It's about not constantly talking over your own feelings, not reflexively stating the opposite of what's raging inside, but listening to yourself again, and gradually learning that you're not broken when you're not fine, but simply human. And that, in a world demanding constant strength, might be the most courageous thing we can do. Chapter 4. The anger I was never allowed to feel. There was a time when I believed anger was something to overcome, something you swallow until it dissolves, something that has no place in a woman who's in control, who's reasonable, understanding, loving. I thought I was better if I kept my anger in check, if I never raised my voice, never demanded, never pounded the table. I believed anger would make me ugly, unpleasant, weak, so I swallowed it, over and over. I was the calm one, the listener, the one who caved, the compromiser, the one who said, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. I was the one who apologized, even when I'd been hurt, the one who showed understanding, even when overlooked. I got so good at hiding my anger that eventually I didn't even know where it was. But it was there, deep inside me, and it hadn't gone away. It was just waiting. Because anger doesn't vanish simply because you suppress it. It grows quiet, yes, but it finds other outlets. It doesn't always smash the table. Sometimes it shows up as a tired withdrawal, a sarcastic smile, sudden coldness toward people who don't even notice. Sometimes it sits heavy in your stomach, or creeps into your shoulders, stiffening your neck, dulling your gaze. I felt my anger most in moments when I was overlooked but still smiling. When I said, "I'm fine," though I was boiling inside. When I hated myself for staying silent again, though 1,000 words lay ready on my tongue. I felt it when I lay awake at night, replaying old conversations, imagining what I could have said if I'd had the courage to let it out. And the longer I suppressed it, the more space it took up in me. Not because the anger disappeared, but because it crowded out other feelings. I couldn't fully rejoice, breathe deeply, or be close, because there was always that unspoken tension that refused to release. And no one knew, because I didn't show it. I didn't show it because I was taught that anger is unfeminine, that it destroys, that you're better off holding it in, that you must remain reasonable, that you must maintain control. And eventually that image became the truth. I'd swallowed so much of it that I no longer knew what real anger felt like. Not raging, not explosive, but honest, clear, setting boundaries, standing up for oneself. I remember one situation that seemed insignificant to others, but was a turning point for me. It wasn't big, just another conversation. I was interrupted for the 3rd time. I smiled as always, let the other finish, nodded politely. But inside, deep down, I felt a crack, a small fissure in the facade. I sensed something stirring within me that had long been dormant. And for the first time I thought, no, I don't want this anymore. It wasn't an outburst, no fight, no scene. Just a quiet decision. I don't want to hide my anger any longer. I don't want to apologize for feelings that show me where my boundary lies. I don't want to be the one who holds back to avoid burdening anyone. Because that's what it came down to. I'd learned that my anger was a burden, something you mustn't show because it disturbs others. And I'd grown so accustomed to that belief I didn't even notice how much it disturbed me. Anger isn't a flaw, it's a reaction. It arises when something goes too far. When something inside you screams, stop. And it doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to protect you. It's the part of you that refuses to accept everything, that remembers you have a right to defend yourself, to be seen, to be taken seriously. I understood that late. Maybe too late for some situations, but not too late for me. I learned there's a difference between impulsive rage and clear anger. The former hurts because it's blind. The latter clarifies because it's conscious. I had to relearn how to use my voice. Not to hurt, but to make myself heard. To say what I need, what I won't tolerate anymore, what I deserve. And each time I did it, something in me trembled. But I did it anyway, and each time it got easier. I long believed my anger would make me ugly, that it would drive people away. But the opposite happened. It made me visible. And in that visibility came a new kind of closeness, more honest, deeper, because I no longer hid, because I was finally whole, not just accommodating, not just understanding, but also clear about what I refused to bear. The anger I was never allowed to feel controlled me long before I acknowledged it. And only when I accepted it could I free myself. Not by yelling, but by taking myself seriously. And perhaps that's the most important thing. I stopped celebrating my strength when it was based on self-denial. I began to find it in my clarity, in my truth, in my no. Anger is not failure. It's a sign that I still feel myself, that I'm not completely lost. And today, I know. As long as I can feel my anger, I can defend my boundaries. As long as I allow my anger, I can remain true to myself. And maybe that's where true strength begins. Not in control, but in the permission to feel yourself fully, with everything that's there, even the anger that once had no place. Chapter 5. Who takes care of me? I got used to being there for others. It was never an obligation. It was simply a natural part of me. I listened, I organized, I helped, I consoled. I was the shoulder people leaned on when the world felt too heavy. The calm center who listened when everything got too loud. I was present, reliable, and I did it well. So well that no one ever thought to ask if maybe I needed someone to take care of me. It wasn't that I begrudged anyone their turn. On the contrary, I loved giving. I loved being the person others could turn to when they felt lost. But at some point, and it didn't happen all at once but bit by bit, a thought began to surface. It was a quiet thought, barely noticeable, that kept coming up whenever I'd been there for someone else, whenever I'd step back to make room for another's pain. Who's there for me if I fall? I had become so used to being strong that I stopped checking if I still wanted it. I was the one answering messages late at night, even though I had no energy left. Having hours-long conversations even when I'd already gone silent inside. Offering understanding even when I felt like screaming. I was the one who always functioned, even when nothing inside worked anymore. And yes, I allowed it. I pushed my boundaries again and again, because I believed it was the right thing to do, because I thought it was my duty, because I was deeply convinced that affection had to be earned, by being available, by not wanting too much, by not bothering others. I wanted to be loved, but please, not be a burden. So I gave without asking. I held without leaning. I carried without ever saying it was hard. Then, one day, it happened. I was home alone, exhausted and emotionally drained, staring into space, and I felt nothing but emptiness. No anger, no frustration, no sadness, just emptiness. And for the first time I spoke the question that had lain within me so long, but I'd never allowed myself to finish. Who actually takes care of me? It wasn't an accusation. No blame. Just an honest, naked realization. I'd spent my whole life caring for others so much that I'd forgotten what real care feels like, when it's directed at me. I knew how to listen, how to comfort, how to hold silence without filling it with cliches. But I no longer knew how it felt when someone truly cared for me, without my having to collapse first to be seen. I began to ask myself when I last told anyone I wasn't okay. Not superficially, but truly, openly, vulnerably. And I realized I hadn't done it in far too long. Not because there was no one to tell, but because I hadn't allowed myself to. Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I, who was always the strong one, should know better, should be better. I had so often overridden myself that it felt almost absurd to suddenly expect care. Yet there was this childlike need, this deep longing to not have to be strong for once, to not have to explain, to not have to function, but simply to be held, unconditionally, without strings, without the fear of being too much. It's a painful process to admit you long for something you've forbidden yourself for so long. Even more painful to see how little you've let others have the chance to be there for you. Not because they wouldn't have wanted to, but because I was so used to handling everything alone that no one thought I might need support. And in that realization lies a quiet sorrow, but also a new clarity. I've started to learn, slowly, that I'm no less worthy if I show vulnerability, that I'm not selfish if I claim space for myself, that I'm not failing if I accept help, and above all, that I don't have to betray myself to be there for others. I may show up as I am, with everything, even with the need to be seen, without having to earn it. Who takes care of me? I've stopped turning that question over in my mind as a silent reprimand. Instead, I've begun to answer it for myself. Not as criticism, but as responsibility. I've started taking myself seriously, asking myself what I need, listening to myself, not only when it's burning, but also in the quiet moments when I sense I'm losing myself. And bit by bit, I've found there are people who stay, who don't run when I don't smile, who aren't unsettled if I don't immediately function, who remain even when I'm not strong. I didn't have to find them. I just had to stop keeping them at bay. It's a slow relearning, a new language I'm speaking, still awkward, still unfamiliar. But I'm speaking it. And every time I ask myself who cares for me, I hear a reply that wasn't there before. One that says, I care. Right now. Not only when I can't anymore. Chapter 6. Being strong also made me selfish. For a long time, I believed strength was my greatest virtue. I was proud of enduring, seeing things through, doing everything on my own. I was convinced I needed no one, that I was enough for myself, that independence was the highest good. And it's true. Being strong often helped me. It protected me from so much, carried me through crises, gave me support when no one else was there. But at some point, quietly and almost imperceptibly, that strength also pushed away the people I actually wanted close. Not because they left, but because I kept them at a distance, piece by piece, without realizing it. I built walls that looked like clarity. I drew boundaries that seemed like self-respect, but were often born of fear. I refused help, not because I didn't need it, but because I thought it would make me weak. I made decisions alone, avoided conversations, repressed my feelings, all under the guise of autonomy. I got so used to being by myself that eventually I grew impatient, even harsh, toward those who had good intentions. I saw closeness as a threat, a potential attack on my independence. And that was the moment when I could no longer call it just strength. It was selfishness too. Not the loud, obvious kind, not the raw I come first in its crude form, but the silent, subtle selfishness that masquerades as self-care, that runs so deep you don't even notice it. I lived my strength so relentlessly that I often left no room for other perspectives, other needs, genuine connection. If someone needed me, I was there. But if someone wanted to draw near, to be honest, to be vulnerable, I became uneasy. I dodged. I retreated. I would say things like, "I'm not in the headspace for that right now," or "I can't handle that at the moment." And sometimes it was true, but other times it was just the excuse of a woman who had forgotten how to truly share. For a long time, being strong meant having no expectations of others. And to be honest, it was convenient. No expectations meant no disappointments. No demands meant no dependencies. I needed no one, and no one could really hurt me. But what I overlooked for too long was that no expectations also mean no real intimacy, no opening up, no risk, and thus no true togetherness. I was so busy keeping everything under control that I often failed to notice how hard others tried to reach me. I didn't see it, or I didn't want to. I tuned out the quiet offers, ignored the tentative approaches. I left messages unanswered, not because I was too busy, but because I didn't know how to open up. I declined invitations, not from disinterest, but from feeling overwhelmed. I was so occupied with preserving my peace, my order, my controlled inner life, that I barely left any space for anyone else. And then it dawned on me. I wasn't just strong. I was closed off, unapproachable, and yes, sometimes unfair, because I expected empathy from others that I myself could no longer give, because I maintained relationships at arm's length while demanding closeness in return, because I was often the first to say, "I'm here for you," while calculating how much it would cost me. I know it sounds harsh. It was hard to recognize it. But I believe it was necessary, because hiding behind the role of the strong one serves no purpose when what you're really afraid of is being seen, fully, with everything that entails. Weaknesses, contradictions, the need for recognition, for understanding, for genuine connections. I had focused so intensely on being invulnerable that I forgot what it felt like to remain touchable. And that behavior had consequences. Relationships that worked on the surface but were empty inside. Friendships that faded because I never truly made room. Moments when I wondered why I so often felt alone, without realizing that I had contributed greatly to my own isolation. Not out of ill will, but out of a misguided self-protection that had become a habit. Today I see it more clearly. Strength is not a free pass for emotional unavailability. And independence must not mean cutting myself off from real relationships. I am learning bit by bit to soften again. Not as weakness, but as a conscious choice. I am learning to listen, to not only my mind, but my heart. I am learning to let others in, not only when I'm strong, but especially when I'm not. It is a slow relearning. I try not to define myself by my achievements, my control, my emotional reserve, but by my ability to be honest, by my willingness to share, by my trust that people will stay even when I fall apart, even when I waver, even when I have no control. Being strong helped me survive, but if I want to truly live, I must learn to become soft again, open, approachable. And that is no less courageous. On the contrary, it may be the bravest thing I have ever done. Chapter 7. The Price of Not Asking for Help. There is a certain pride that doesn't appear as pride. It dresses itself in independence, efficiency, in, "I've got this." And for a long time I thought that was strength, a sign of maturity, doing everything on your own, not asking, not being a bother. I got used to finding solutions instead of seeking support. I was the one who always had everything under control, at least on the outside. And deep down I believed it was the right way, the safe way, the way that made me untouchable. What I failed to understand was that every decision not to ask for help comes with a price, and that price is not always visible. It accumulates quietly, in exhaustion, in inner distance, in the feeling of forever fighting alone. It's a price you don't pay all at once, but bit by bit. With every day you force a smile when you want to scream. With every night you toss and turn because you don't know where to put your thoughts. With every moment you say, "I'm fine," even though you're running on empty. I had learned early on that help is something you have to earn, that you don't simply receive it unless you're already at the breaking point, when the flames are visible. And even then, part of me resisted. Something inside me said, "Pull yourself together. You can do this. You're strong." I refused aid so often, even when it was offered. Not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't know how to accept it without feeling weak. I remember moments when I almost begged someone to see behind my facade, to sense how close I was to collapse. But at the same time, I did everything to hide it. I wanted help, but I didn't want to ask for it. I wanted to be understood, without having to explain myself. And that doesn't work. Because intimacy requires courage. The courage to show up. The courage to say, "I can't do this alone." Yet that moment was always the hardest for me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, almost ashamed. I feared losing control if I asked for help, as if admitting defeat. And for someone like me, who valued self-reliance above all, that was almost unbearable. So I kept going. I took on responsibility. I carried more than was healthy. I teetered between exhaustion and perfection, and called it life. But this life took its toll. I was often irritable, hollow inside, emotionally cut off. I wasn't present because I was too busy functioning. And I realized it wasn't only the stress wearing me down. It was the constant burden of having no one to share the load. Not because no one was there, but because I let no one in. I wondered where it came from, the conviction that I must go it alone. Maybe it was upbringing, maybe experiences in which help never came when I needed it. Maybe it was that early belief that it's safer not to rely on others. After all, if you don't lean on anyone, you can't fall. If you trust no one, you can't be disappointed. It was a defense mechanism, one that eventually became my way of life. But eventually I understood. This defense not only shields pain, it also shields connection. Trust, tenderness, humanity. I had forced myself into a role that cut me off from everything I cared about. And there I stood, strong and untouchable, but lonely, deeply lonely. I had to learn that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but an act of connection. That I'm not less if I fall. That my worth isn't tied to how much I can endure alone. I had to give myself permission not always to function, not always to carry everything. I had to remember that I am human, not just a mechanism. It began in small steps. A sincere, "I can't handle this right now." A quiet, "Can you be there for me?" And "I don't know what to do next." At first, each word was a battle. My pride rebelled. My old voice said, "You're a burden. Pull yourself together." But I stayed. I spoke. I let it in, and something shifted. Not outwardly, but inside me. I saw that the world didn't collapse if I relinquished control. That people didn't run away when I showed vulnerability. On the contrary, some drew closer, because they finally had genuine access to me. Because I was no longer just the strong one, but the real one. With doubts, with tears, with uncertainty. Today, I know. The price of not asking for help is too high. It costs you connection with yourself. It drains your strength until you have none left. It costs closeness, trust, healing, and all that for an ideal that leaves you empty. I have learned to show up, even when it's uncomfortable. I have learned to allow myself not to be perfect. And I have learned that it is a profound form of self-care to ask for help before you break. Because sometimes the bravest step is not to hold on, but to let go. To look and say, I need you. Now. Chapter 8. The day I got tired of pretending. It wasn't a loud day. No drama, no big bang, no collapse into tears before an audience. No sudden outburst of anger or deep fall. It was much more mundane. It was quiet, very quiet. Yet in that silence, something was final. Something inside me was done. Not exhausted in the classic sense, not physically, not visibly, but internally, in a way I could no longer conceal. I was spent. Not angry, not sad, simply empty. And that made it clear. I could not go on like before. It was the day I got tired of pretending. I had been functioning so well for so long, smiling through meetings, leading conversations, making decisions, showing strength, empathy, composure. I had been there for everyone. I had bluff acted as if I were fine, though inside I was running on reserves long ago. I played the role perfectly. The one who always has a clear head, who listens, who doesn't break down, who handles everything. The one who is never overwhelmed, never wavers. And eventually I began to believe my own performance. But on that day, I couldn't do it anymore. I sat alone in my living room, a coffee cup in hand, staring at a spot on the wall. And it was as if I suddenly realized I hadn't really breathed in years. As if I'd been holding my breath my whole life to keep going, to not burden anyone, to appear strong, to please. And I asked myself, what am I even doing all this for? For whom am I keeping this up? And why did I think I was worthless otherwise? I had internalized so thoroughly that I had to be good-humored, well-organized, high-performing, that I stopped questioning it. I said sure when I meant no. I laughed when I wanted to withdraw. I listened when I was barely present. I got up when my body cried out for rest. All out of fear. Fear of being inconvenient. Fear of rejection if I was no longer the strong one. If I was no longer the one people could count on. If I couldn't endure everything. But on that day I realized I was no longer myself. I was a version of myself I had created to survive. A role that helped me get by. A mask I wore so as not to stand out, not to disturb, not to fail. And I had worn it so often, I no longer knew who I was beneath it. I didn't make a grand decision. I didn't quit my job. I didn't move to another city. I didn't throw my phone into a river and catch a train to nowhere. I did nothing that would make a movie turn. I simply stopped playing along. Inside, I stopped pretending. I stopped smiling when I didn't feel like it. I stopped responding immediately to messages. I stopped going to appointments just because I thought I had to. I stopped uttering words I didn't stand behind. And that was the real turning point. I began to listen to myself. Not my thoughts, but my body, my gut, my feelings. I asked, do I really want this right now? Is this truly mine? Or am I just playing along? And often the answer was uncomfortable. because it showed me how much I had neglected myself, how often I had betrayed myself to fit in, not to stand out, to be liked. I was done pretending to be perfect, done censoring myself, done having empty conversations, done functioning like a machine because I thought it was normal. I wanted to be real again. And yes, that meant I would no longer please everyone. Some would be irritated when I started saying no, when I stopped automatically showing understanding, when I set boundaries. But in that irritation lay freedom. I began to lose people, not because I changed, but because I finally stopped pretending. And that was okay. It was sad, yes, but necessary. Because I no longer wanted relationships built on roles. I didn't want encounters where I couldn't be myself. I didn't want conversations where I had to mute my truth so it wouldn't be too loud. The day I got tired of pretending wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. And that honesty set something in motion. It was like an inner crack through which light finally shone. Not blinding, not overwhelming, but real, warm, still, clear. I didn't vow never to function again. I still function, sometimes more than is healthy, but I do it consciously. I no longer do it out of fear, no longer because I believe I'm not enough otherwise. I do it because I want to feel myself again, because I remember what truth feels like, what clarity feels like, and how hungry I was for it. I will not return to that role, no matter how safe it felt. I don't want to go back to a life where I lose myself to please. I want to be honest, even if that means not everyone stays. I want to feel what's there, even if it's uncomfortable. And that resolution, quiet as it was the beginning of something new. Not a new me, not an optimized version, but a me I dared to trust again. No mask, no theater, no obligation to be perfect. Just me. And that is enough. Finally. Chapter 9. The guilt of not being able to continue. It wasn't the pain that paralyzed me, not the chaos, not even the fatigue. It was the guilt. The quiet, sticky, constant guilt that clung to everything I felt as soon as I even thought of stopping. It was there when I admitted I couldn't go on. It was there when I needed a moment just for myself. It was there when I said no, though I felt an unspoken yes was expected. And it was loudest when I tried to put myself first. I hadn't learned to take care of myself. I had learned to persevere, to be strong, to pull myself together. I had learned that rest equals weakness, that exhaustion is something you must overcome, that others count on you, while you are just a function. I was the one who endured, who carried, who always got back up. And over time that became a given, not only for others, but for myself. But at some point I couldn't anymore. And when I admitted that to myself, the guilt rushed in. A voice inside asking how I dared to say, I can't do this anymore. As if it were a crime to reach my limit. As if wanting to put down my burden was an act of ingratitude. As if my worth were tied to my stamina. I felt guilty for withdrawing, for no longer having the energy to reply to messages, to hold conversations, to be there for others. I felt guilty because I sensed I was not the same person anymore, yet couldn't explain why. I felt guilty because I wasn't only exhausted but also angry. At myself, at my surroundings, at the role I had forced upon myself. And worse, I felt guilty because I was ashamed, because I felt I wasn't enough, not strong enough, not resilient enough, not high-performing enough. I compared myself to those who, despite everything, kept going, who seemed never to doubt, who laughed while I was empty. And I asked myself, what is wrong with me? Why can't I do the same? Why am I so sensitive, so fragile, so unstable? I began hiding my exhaustion more than before. I put on the reflexive smile. I talked myself up as strong. I uttered reassuring phrases, to others and to myself. And inside I battled the feeling that I had failed. I didn't want anyone to notice how far I had fallen. Not out of pride, but out of fear. Fear that no one would stay if I stopped functioning. That guilt gnawed at everything, my thoughts, my body, my decisions. It made me numb and prevented me from being honest with myself and others. How could I say, I can't go on, when I didn't even feel entitled to that, right? It took time to understand where the guilt came from. It wasn't new. It was part of something I had long regarded as a virtue. I had once been proud of my endurance, proud of being strong even when it hurt. I had tied my self-worth to how much I could give, how much I could carry, how little I demanded. And now I was asked to question all of it? It was hard to bear, to stand without masks, without facades, with only that one sentence in my mind. I can't anymore. I first muttered it internally, then whispered it, then spoke it in a conversation, the first honest one in a long time. And I saw in the other person's eyes not judgment or disappointment, but recognition, compassion, understanding. That's when I realized I was not alone in this guilt. I was not the only one who blamed herself for being weak. We live in a world that values achievement over humanity, functioning over feeling, in which it seems braver to carry on than to stop and say, this can't go on like this. But that is the courage I had to learn. The courage to admit to myself that I don't have to do everything, that there is no shame in being exhausted, that I don't owe anyone justification when my soul needs a break, that I may stop before I break. And perhaps that is the true strength, not endurance, but letting go, not the never-ending onward, but the conscious pause, not doing, but honestly being. I no longer carry the guilt as I once did. It's not gone, far from it, but I recognize it sooner. I sense it when I slip back into old patterns, when I tell myself I must, when I start belittling myself for not being able to give more. And in those moments I remind myself that I do not become a better person by sacrificing myself, and that no one benefits when I lose myself. I may withdraw. I may say it's too much. I may be silent. I may feel what I feel, even if it's uncomfortable. And I may let go of the need to be perfect to be loved. Because in the end, I am not here to endure everything. I am here to live, in my own time, in my own truth, with all that I can do, and all that I cannot. Chapter 10. Saying goodbye to the perfect image. It took me a long time to realize that I did not truly belong to myself. Not really. Not as a person, but as an image. A version of myself I had carefully assembled, piece by piece, expectation by expectation. I was not the one who simply was. I was the one who had become. Shaped by reactions, by comments, by comparisons, by silent glances that told me what was okay and what was not. I was an image, polished and controlled, smooth and tailored, and I had worn it so long I thought it was my face. I knew exactly how I had to present myself. Not too loud, not too needy, not too emotional. Intelligent but not arrogant. Kind but not weak. Strong but with a smile. Please. I was disciplined, high-performing, independent, understanding, and, as people often told me, admirably clear. But what nobody knew was how that clarity froze me inside, how it forced me always to know what I was doing, how it kept me from simply saying, I have no idea what I want. I'm lost. I upheld that image because I believed it gave me security, because I thought I would only be loved if I showed no contradictions, if I remained reliable, if I met expectations, if I never overstepped. I worked so hard not to be a burden that I became a muted version of myself, not out of cowardice, but out of fear of showing the wrong side. Because perfection was like armor, hard, gleaming and cold. And at some point I noticed I was tired, not of life, but of performing. I was weary of functioning, weary of the constant effort to be right, weary of moderation, of endlessly polishing every word, every decision, every moment. I was tired of carrying so many versions of myself at once that I eventually couldn't tell where I began and ended. The first time I felt I wanted to let go of that image was not like a triumphant liberation. It was a quiet, almost sad moment. I stood before the mirror, saw how tired my face looked, not just physically, but with that deep exhaustion of someone who has tried too long to appear perfect. I looked at myself, honestly, without pose, and thought, I hardly recognize you. And yet I hesitated. Because what remains when you give up the perfect image? Who am I if I no longer function, if I no longer strive to be my best, if I no longer try to enter every room in control? What is left when the mask falls? Will anyone stay? Will I even stay? I began giving myself space, tentatively at first. I allowed myself to make mistakes, real ones, not just the charming, forgivable kind. I spoke without overthinking each sentence. I remained silent even though I knew a response was expected. I drifted, even though my mind panicked, trying to reclaim the helm. And I cried, not dramatically, not for a film, but quietly, exhausted, relieved, because I felt I was still here, behind it all. It was a painful, beautiful process. I saw sides of myself I had long hidden, contradictory, sometimes hard to bear, vulnerable, illogical, emotional. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. Not perfect, but real. I began letting people in, not to prove something, but because I no longer wanted to be alone in that role. Because I finally understood that love is not the result of performance, that closeness doesn't come from control, and that you are not less worthy if you don't shine. I did lose something, and that was inevitable. I lost people who could only tolerate me in my strong, tidy, predictable version. I lost security, illusions, a piece of control. But I gained something I hadn't expected. Freedom, inner spaciousness, depth. I gained the possibility of no longer constantly watching myself. I no longer had to explain, no longer had to apologize for my darkness, my contradictions, my wounds. I no longer had to do everything right. And perhaps that was the most beautiful moment of all. I didn't celebrate saying goodbye to the perfect image. I carried it out in silence. In each small decision, in every no offered without justification, in every moment I didn't know what would come next and still didn't pretend to have a plan. In every encounter in which I said, this is how I am right now, and nothing more. I learned that I don't have to improve myself to be seen. That I don't have to work on myself to be lovable. That I don't have to shine to belong. I am not perfect. And that is not just okay, it is true. And I will no longer suppress the truth just so the image looks right. I would rather be torn and sincere than flawless and hollow. I know it sounds grand, but in reality, it's the small things every day that matter. Silencing my phone even though someone is waiting for an answer. Sending a refusal even though I'm invited. Saying something that won't be well received. Showing myself as I am, even if it means not being liked. Because this is me. Not perfect, but honest. Chapter 11. Even silence speaks. There was a time when I believed I always had to say something. I had to explain, justify, mediate. I had to shape my thoughts into words so they'd have value, package my feelings so someone could understand them. I thought only what becomes loud exists, only what's spoken carries meaning. And perhaps that was true once. Maybe I needed words so I wouldn't lose myself, so I wouldn't drown amid expectations, misunderstandings, unspoken conflicts. But at some point, something inside me shifted. I began to fall silent. Not out of resignation, not out of fear, but because I no longer had the strength to keep explaining myself. This silence wasn't a retreat. It was a stopping, a conscious release of the need to be understood. I realized how much energy it had cost me to keep searching for words that would build bridges to people who weren't even willing to cross them. Too often I'd tried to make myself heard in rooms where no one was really listening. And then I understood. If you must always explain yourself, you're not in the right place. My silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. It was the choice to stop knocking on doors that would never open. It was the moment I ceased defending myself, for my pace, for my emotions, for my tiredness, for my clarity. It was the quiet no I'd long refused to allow myself. No dramatic break, no loud boundary, just an inner step back, a moment of stillness. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. I heard myself again, without noise, without outside opinions, without the constant struggle for acceptance. I sat there in my own stillness and felt, for the first time in ages, that I am enough, even without words, without achievement, without justification. I was simply there, and that was enough. People reacted to my silence in different ways. Some felt unsettled. Some withdrew. Others grew nervous, tried to draw me out, asked for conversations, for answers, for clarity. And I understood. For many, silence is threatening because it holds up a mirror, because it creates space in which they confront themselves, because there's no more distraction, no talking, no relativizing, only what is. But I no longer feared that space. I had learned to hold it, for me, for my truth, for my pace. And I realized that not every silence needs filling, that not every conversation is necessary, that you don't always have to speak just because it's expected. I allowed myself to be silent. I allowed myself to step out. I allowed myself to choose not to answer when I sensed the question didn't come from genuine interest. I remember a moment that felt like a turning point. It was an argument, or rather, an attempted argument. Someone confronted me, demanded a reaction, an explanation, a counter-argument. I felt everything inside me coil, my old pattern ready to kick in, defend, argue, relent. But I did nothing. I looked at the person, took a deep breath, and said nothing. Not out of stubbornness, not out of passivity, but out of clarity. Because I knew that in that moment not a single word of mine would change anything. I was simply tired of dragging my truth into discussions that only served to uphold old patterns. That silence wasn't cold. It wasn't dismissive. It was dignified. It was what I'd long denied myself. Permission not to play along everywhere, not to join every game, not to justify every feeling with words. I understood that silence is not lack, it's choice. And sometimes it's the most honest form of communication. Of course, there's another kind of silence. The wounded, the powerless, the silence born of fear or helplessness. I know that too. I've been there. But the silence I mean, the silence I speak of today, is different. It isn't muteness. It's boundary setting. It's a way to protect yourself without raising your voice. A form of strength that needs no facade, only presence. I began to slow down in conversations, not because I had nothing to say, but because I felt that many words don't clarify but obscure. I started listening more than speaking. I sensed sooner whether dialogue could arise, or whether I was simply talking to a wall again. And I chose silence more often. Not out of indifference, but out of respect. For myself, for my journey, for my need for depth over volume. Inside me, it grew quieter. The inner critic who always had to speak grew calmer. The constant self-monitoring eased. I no longer needed to explain myself in my head because I knew. I am allowed simply to feel. I am allowed to be, without reason, without proof. And the more I allowed that, the clearer my communication became. Not because I spoke more, but because what I did say came from a place that was real. I no longer had to be loud to be heard. I no longer had to talk at length to be understood. I only had to stay true to myself. I have learned that my silence doesn't mean I have nothing to say. On the contrary, it means I no longer need to say everything to feel myself, and that I may take the space to stay quiet even when others make noise. Because my silence is not empty. It speaks, and I listen. Chapter 12. Being vulnerable doesn't make me weak. For a long time, I believed vulnerability was dangerous, that it left me exposed, a sign of instability. I thought anyone who showed vulnerability risked not being taken seriously. I'd learned to protect myself, not with weapons, but with posture, restraint, control, distance. I held myself upright even when I was broken inside. I smiled when I felt like crying. I said, "I'm fine," when nothing felt fine. And every time I repeated that reflex, the wall between me and the world grew a little higher. I wasn't cold. I was just cautiously controlled. I showed strength because I thought that's the only way people would listen. I showed clarity because I believed uncertainty meant insufficiency. I spoke in coherent sentences even when my inner world was chaos. I wanted to preserve the image that had given me security for years. The image of someone who endures, analyzes, needs no one. But the more I identified with that, the further I drifted from my humanity. Because deep inside I was exhausted. Tired of having to keep everything under control. Tired of suppressing the tremors. Tired of hoping someone would notice how much effort it took me to hold up the facade. But I never showed it. I believed that if I opened up, I'd lose respect. If I admitted my vulnerability, I'd lose control. And control meant for me safety, survival, dignity. Then came that moment, not planned, not conscious. A moment when I could no longer hold back. I was in a conversation. One of those conversations where it's no longer about proving anything. And I cracked. Not dramatically. No grand monologue, no theatrical tears. Just a soft, honest, "I can't do this right now." And a look that was genuine, for the first time in ages. I no longer appeared strong. I wasn't coherent. I didn't know how to save myself in that moment. And yet I was there, open, stripped bare, real. And nothing terrible happened. Quite the opposite. The other person stayed. Something shifted. Not in the words, but in the dynamic. I was seen, not as a project or a problem, but as a human being. I wasn't judged. I was held, not physically, but in the space we shared. It wasn't weakness that flowed through me. It was clarity, relief, and a quiet sorrow for all the years I'd denied myself this experience. I'd long believed vulnerability made me weak, because I didn't know how much courage it takes to truly show yourself, how much inner stability it requires to say, "I don't know. I need something right now. I am hurt." Those sentences are not small. They're not weak. They stand tall, not in the body, but in the soul. I've learned that opening up doesn't make me smaller. Admitting I'm not always stable doesn't make me less worthy. Showing weakness, allowing uncertainty, touching the soft spots I usually protect like treasures. It makes me more genuine. And with that authenticity comes connection, depth, trust. Not everywhere, not always, but wherever it arises, it sustains. I had to unlearn much of what I thought strength meant. I had to let go of the belief that a strong person always appears composed, remains unshakable, rises without trembling. True strength isn't perfect exterior. It's conscious interior. It's the quiet allowance of what rages within. It's the moment you stay with yourself, in pain, in uncertainty, in doubt. I was so busy giving others stability that I denied softness to myself. I kept myself so occupied with not being a burden that I ignored my own needs. I convinced myself that was strength, maturity, self-control. But control without self-contact is nothing but emotional avoidance. And eventually, it leaves you hollow. Today I know how precious it is when someone truly shows themselves, without masks, without defenses. And I know how much stirs within me when I do the same. It isn't easy. I still slip into old patterns. I still feel shame when I'm vulnerable, fear that I'm too much, worry someone can't handle my openness. But I stay open anyway. Not for everyone, not always, but where it feels right, where I'm held without having to perform. Vulnerability isn't a state you enter when you have nothing left to lose. It's a choice, an attitude, an upright honesty with yourself. And it doesn't mean you open up to everyone. It means you stop closing yourself off. I've stopped equating vulnerability with weakness. It isn't a deficit. It's an access point to myself, to others, to what's possible between us when we no longer hide behind roles, expectations, and poses. I am not less when I open up. I am more palpable, more truthful, more alive. And I don't regret beginning. Chapter 13. The hugs I never asked for. I don't know when exactly I stopped asking for closeness. Maybe it was gradual, maybe early. Perhaps I simply stopped because the embraces never came when I needed them, or because I learned that wanting them seemed weak, childish, inappropriate. I recall countless moments when I would have given anything to have someone just hold me, quietly, without questions, without words, without explanation. Yet I never asked. Instead, I smiled, nodded, took a breath, squared my shoulders. I convinced myself I didn't need it, that I could manage alone, that I didn't want to burden others, that at my age, with my mind, my clarity, wanting someone to hold me would be ridiculous. I dissected my own needs, devalued them, convinced myself I was stronger for expecting nothing. I thought I'd stay safe if I held back. For what could be worse than asking for a hug only to be met with puzzled looks? So I didn't ask. I waited, silently, and hoped someone would notice just how badly I needed it. How often I stood there, emotionally naked, loud inside, quiet outside, and no one came. And each time I suppressed that silent longing, I packed a little piece of myself away, tied it up for safekeeping. Not out of spite, but out of self-protection, because nothing hurts more than the need for closeness going unanswered. There were times I kept so much distance I forgot I was once touchable. I was efficient, organized, friendly, composed. The one people could talk to, who understood, comforted, stayed strong. Yet no one looked me in the eye and said, "You seem tired. Come here." No one simply put an arm around me without me having earned it first with words or a smile. And I thought, that's just how it is when you're the strong one, the one who works, who never falls. But then came rare, fleeting moments. A casual touch, a hand on my shoulder, a hug I hadn't asked for, and it stirred something in me I thought I'd forgotten. My body sank into itself, not from weakness, but relief, because it could finally let go, because even if only for seconds, it was held. I realized my need for closeness had never disappeared. I'd just learned too well how to hide it. I'd so internalized that I needed no one that I eventually forgot how to receive. I let no one get close enough, not out of arrogance, but out of fear. Fear of being too much, or worse, too little. If I'm honest, more than anything, I wanted to feel that I wasn't alone with the storm inside me. I didn't want to speak or explain. I just wanted to be held unconditionally for a moment. I wanted someone to show, without words, I see you. I can bear you. And we underestimate how powerful such gestures are, how healing a touch can be when it comes free of conditions, when it doesn't ask if you're strong, if you're doing everything right, if you deserve it. The hugs I never asked for were never small gestures. They were silent signs of life. They could have told me I'm allowed to be weak without risking the relationship, that I don't have to give to get, that I don't have to break to be held. And that's what I didn't know then, that I have the right to feel closeness even when I bring no crisis. I had to learn that longing for a hug, for real physical and emotional closeness, isn't immature. It isn't weak to crave touch. It's a deeply human need, one that connects us, reminds us we're not machines or roles or functions, but feeling beings who sometimes just need an arm around us when the world is too loud. I'd not only forbidden others to hug me, I'd forbidden myself. I told myself I had neither time, space, nor permission. I ducked away when someone came close, not out of coldness, but uncertainty. I'd forgotten what closeness feels like when it isn't tied to performance. I forgot how to let go without fear of being dropped. But today I remember, not perfectly, not always, but I'm learning. I practice saying, I need you now, not for a solution, just for a moment, for an arm around my shoulders. And sometimes I don't say it in words, but with my eyes, with silence, with the courage not to flee when someone offers their hand. And I let it happen, not because I'm weak, but because I'm strong enough to open my walls little by little. It's not about being touched all the time. It's about giving yourself permission to be touchable, to stop feeling ashamed of wanting closeness, to stop thinking you must do it all alone, to recognize that wanting to be held isn't weakness, but humanity. And perhaps true strength begins precisely where we stop pretending we'd rather do it alone. Chapter 14. The Emotional Legacy We Carry. Sometimes I'm not sure which decisions in my life were truly mine. Not because I didn't consciously make them, but because I realized that much of what I took for granted, my reactions, my fears, my need for control, my reserved way of handling closeness, didn't come from me at all. It came from something that was there long before I even knew how to think. Something silently handed down, not in words, but in gestures, in glances, in what isn't said, but felt every day. Something I adopted without questioning. A quiet inheritance I've carried as long as I can remember. I'm talking about what we don't choose but still live. The emotional patterns that run through generations like shadows at our heels. The fear of being too much, the fear of being too little. The uncertainty whether we have the right to take up space, to show feelings, to say no, to demand, to fall, to heal. All that we carry without always knowing where it began. I've watched the women in my family, strong, silent, self-sacrificing, hard on themselves, but gentle with everyone else. Women who functioned without complaint, never learned they could be more than reliable, who battled their anger inwardly, stifled disappointment in chores and duties, transformed sadness into conversations where others always took priority. I saw their posture, their body language, their silence, and I understood. It wasn't ill-intentioned. It was their way to survive. And me? I absorbed so much of that. Unintentionally, unconsciously. I learned to pull myself together, grit my teeth, endure. I felt that softness was dangerous, that vulnerability meant loss. I inherited those unspoken messages, this quiet self-denial disguised as strength, this notion that you earn acknowledgement by holding yourself back. And I didn't question it for a long time because it felt familiar, safe, loyal. But one day something inside me began to rebel. Not loudly, not instantly, a subtle friction, an unease I could no longer ignore. I sensed I was hitting boundaries I never drew myself, fulfilling expectations that weren't mine, playing roles I never wrote for myself. And I realized, this is not my whole self, not my origin. It's a passed-down pain I no longer want to carry just because someone else did before me. I started questioning my reactions. Why do I feel guilty when I say no? Why do I withdraw when I'm overwhelmed instead of asking for help? Why is it so hard to voice my needs without justifying them? The answers weren't only in my own story, but in those that began before me, in the unspoken messages of my mother, my grandmother, perhaps even further back, in the silent transmission of fear, control, compliance. And it was painful to acknowledge, because it meant I had to take responsibility, not for what I'd inherited, but for what I made of it. I could no longer say, that's just how I am. I couldn't point to what was modeled for me as if it were law. I had to look, sort anew, discover what truly belongs to me, and what I only carry because it was handed to me. I remember a conversation with my mother when it dawned on me that she never learned to comfort herself, that she saw her tears as defeat. And I never blamed her for not knowing better. But I also never allowed myself to do differently. I adopted her pattern out of loyalty, wanting to be strong like her. And in doing so, I forgot that freedom lies not in repetition, but in change. I began to let go inwardly, of the belief that I must be tough to be taken seriously, that my worth depends on my endurance, of the reflex to shrink myself to be loved. And I learned that letting go isn't betrayal, that I don't dishonor anyone by refusing to carry their pain, that laying down emotional baggage can be an act of dignity, saying, it ends here. But it doesn't happen overnight. It's a quiet process, starting with awareness, with honesty, with the willingness to meet yourself anew, and with the decision not to repeat everything just because it's familiar. I had to relearn myself. What do I really need? What feels truly mine, and what only feels habitual? This emotional legacy we carry isn't our enemy. It's part of our story, but it mustn't dictate our future. We can look at it, honor it, name it, and then choose differently. We can be softer where once there was hardness, silent where once only function mattered, visible where invisibility felt safer. And we can leave new traces, not because we're better, but because we want to be free. I still carry parts of it. I feel them on days when old patterns pull me back, when I feel shame for my feelings, when I hold myself back because I think I must be strong. But now I recognize it sooner. I no longer get stuck. I breathe. I ask myself whether that's really me or just an echo from before. And that alone changes everything. Chapter 15. When the body speaks for me. I remember exactly the moment my body first spoke louder than my words. It was an afternoon at the office. I sat at my desk, typing, sorting emails, scheduling appointments, and suddenly I felt a tightness in my chest, a burning in my throat, as if something was about to burst. I took a deep sip of coffee and tried to continue, but my hands were shaking. Not dramatically, under control, but noticeably. I realized I was sending myself a message I couldn't say aloud. Stop. But I didn't stop. Not right away. For years I spoke to my head. Everything is fine, stress is normal, time is scarce, people naturally expect more of me. Yet my body began to lose patience. It alerted me with headaches that tunneled through my brain, with tension in my neck that released as pressure at night, with insomnia as my heart raced when I tried to rest. And then there was a constant weight on my chest, as if someone placed a stone there and said, endure. And endure I did. I wanted to ignore it, rationalize it. Too much work, too little exercise, poor diet, normal fatigue. But those explanations no longer sufficed. The language of my body was different, clear, unmistakable. It forced me to pause because it would no longer bear what I demanded. It intervened when I least wanted to hear it. I felt doubt creeping in about my choices, my pace, my high effort. I sensed something inside me crying out but having no words, no energy to manifest. So my body sent signals, loud, uncomfortable signals. And I faced a choice: ignore them and risk things worsening, or stop and listen. I began to give myself conscious space. No drama, no drastic cut, just small decisions. I put my phone away. I stopped multitasking. I stayed silent in conversations that left me drained. I breathed deeply instead of frantically. I moved my body instead of hiding. I cooked real meals instead of grabbing whatever. I went to bed instead of numbing out with series. And I realized my body wasn't working against me. It wasn't failing. It was helping me. It was sending a signal because it could no longer tolerate being ignored. It wanted to save me long before collapse. It's part of my intelligence, one I'd overridden too long in favor of my mind. I don't mean to sound dramatic, but this insight was a turning point. It was as if a door opened inside me, letting feelings flow, bodily awareness, grace toward myself. I felt joy again in small moments. Sunlight on my face, the buzz after a short stretch break, opening a window in the morning. I felt whole again, not just a function, but a living body. My body taught me that balance isn't a formula, but a conversation, an exchange between thought and feeling. It taught me that my worth isn't measured by what I accomplish, but by how kindly I treat myself. It taught me that breaks aren't failure but feedback, that exhaustion is a signal, not an invitation to sprint on. It wasn't an overnight transformation. I didn't become someone else in a day, but I began to ease up on the pressure. I began to interpret the signs. I began to recognize that my body isn't an extra, it's my closest ally. And I started to protect it, not with discipline at the expense of vitality, but with care. Today, I still feel it. The pounding when I forget to listen, the fatigue when I overdo it, the quick pulse when I chase perfection. But now I can respond. Now I can step out. Now I can say, stop. My body is speaking. And I listen, not as a bystander, but as a partner. Because it's not just about speaking. It's about listening. And my body has much to say when I let it. Chapter 16. Stopping trying to please everyone to be able to breathe. A thought followed me for a long time. If everyone likes me, I'm popular. In other words, being liked is my duty. I oriented myself around what others needed instead of what I needed. I expected closeness to arise if I adapted unobtrusively. Unconsciously, I placed myself at others' service because I believed that was a meaningful life. And I gave so much of myself that eventually almost nothing remained. Neither for myself, nor for anyone who truly wanted to see me. The first time I felt what that was like was on a Sunday evening. I had spent the entire weekend meeting expectations, visits, smiles, small talk, plans I didn't want. I had been running, physically, inwardly. And when I sank onto the couch Sunday night, I was so exhausted that breathing itself felt difficult. I inhaled, exhaled, and felt how I had lost myself. Not outwardly, but within. That emptiness after a flood of words, compromises, needs that weren't mine. And then came a quiet decision. I want to live differently. I started small. I no longer said yes to everything. I first tested it with minor things. I declined an invitation that wore me out more than it delighted me. I said no to a favor that made my heart hesitate. I felt that tug in my stomach, as if I were swimming against a current. Because I had been so trained to serve the current that with a single no, I changed something. Not only that day, but inside myself. Nobody collapsed. Nobody ran away screaming. On the contrary, some looked at me puzzled. Others drew nearer, relieved, because they no longer had to meet someone who always worked perfectly. I noticed how liberating it was not to be carried, not to have to respond in kind, just to exist. I felt my own rhythm again, no longer dictated by others. My heart had room to breathe again. I could slow down, not because I was lazy, but because I no longer rushed to please others. I could feel myself in every moment, fatigue, joy, pain, desire. I felt them all once more. But that was not the end. It was the beginning of a journey. I began to question myself. Which parts of me function only to be accepted? Which topics do I keep alive so as not to stand out? Which appointments and tasks do I fulfill merely out of habit because they belong to my role and not to my needs? And so I began to declutter my life. Not the house, but the to-do list. Not the apartment, but my relationships. Things that strained my interior. Things I did without feeling. I discovered that it is a quiet luxury to be unobtrusive, and a great act of self-respect to say no. I discovered that I move in my own life, not in a staging. There were difficult moments. I felt selfish, believing that every refusal burdened others. And yes, sometimes it did. But I also felt that I owed nobody anything, except myself. And because I no longer denied myself, I could truly meet others without a mask. I could really listen, not just react. I could engage, without losing myself. Gradually, I noticed that my relationships changed. Not all of them. Some people drifted away, because they didn't know my new self. Some drew closer, because they sought genuine connection instead of mere propriety. I didn't always soar higher, but I flew cleaner, more authentically, with real room to breathe. And I learned that self-respect is not a luxury to afford when convenient. It is the foundation of who I am. And without trusting that foundation, there can be no space to breathe. Then life becomes an effort instead of an encounter. I wish I had known earlier that my worth doesn't lie in my function, but in my being. That my heart doesn't wait to be loved out of availability, but out of a clear, calm decision to be myself. Even if that means saying no. Even if it means disappointing some expectations. But because my life awaits me, with pauses, depth, truth. I continue to choose to stop trying to please everyone in order to breathe. Not forever, not perfectly, but anew each day. Because true freedom is not a luxury, it is an attitude. And because I'd rather live, consciously, clearly, breathing freely, than merely function. Chapter 17. The freedom to break without guilt. There are times when my inner self can no longer hold, not because I am too weak, but because I have carried too much within: distress, pressure, expectations, disappointment, fear. Previously, in moments when I hit my limits, I would reflexively do more, keep functioning, keep myself intact, smile. But one day, I realized that being silent, crying, breaking down, are not signs of weakness, but of aliveness, because they show that the body-mind system is still working. And I felt, I may stop, I may break, and I may do so in freedom, without guilt. The first time I felt that freedom was when I sat alone in my apartment. The lights dimmed, the room around me empty, and I cried for no reason, simply because it felt like a breakthrough. I wasn't ill. I had no cause. I simply felt after all the time I had suppressed my feelings. The tears came because I was reclaiming myself. I cried because something new was hoisted, and the old broke. Suddenly there was no urge to be strong. It was like, at last you may breathe. I hadn't said or proven anything. I had consented, let myself fall. In that moment I knew I was experiencing something both very vulnerable and very strong. It was allowed, it was necessary, and it was the bravest thing I could do. Leave myself to myself. What more did I need? Running safe, an image, satisfied people. Everything deserted me once I let my soul find its language, not in words, but in tears, trembling, panic, soft despair. I understood over time. Sometimes breaking is not an end but a dissolution, a cleansing and a new beginning. When I cry, something discharges, and I am not left destroyed. Though broken, yet open, I feel wide, even despite the fragments. One evening, a dialogue took place in which I didn't speak, but sobbed so deeply I couldn't form clear words. A conversation that wasn't called for, but forced itself upon us because I could go no further. I wept and the other stayed. He held my hand without a word. That moment wasn't comfort in the classic sense. It was being with. A silent consent. I remain with you. And it became clear to me. If I allow myself to break, I also prepare others to hold me, not out of duty but out of human connection. Breaking without guilt means I remove myself from the system that forces me to be stable. I free myself from that merciless norm of always having to function. I detach from the judgment in my head that says, "Who breaks is weak." I break that. And I say, I am here, with tears, with chaos, with despair, and I remain alive. It transforms my relationship with myself. I may see myself and let myself be. Not neatly sorted, not lined up in rows, but chaotic, fractured, authentic. And with every tear I shed masks. Every tremor breaks down walls that keep me small. Each quiver brings me into contact with what truly exists in me. Hope, pain, desire, spaciousness. I began to preserve the times in my everyday life when I broke. I no longer swept them under the rug. I no longer treated them as something that happens but has no meaning. I treated them with reverence. I spoke inwardly. Good that you're crying. Good that you're breaking. And suddenly such moments were no longer deviations but components of my being. It isn't easy to see it that way. In a world that celebrates stability, applauds control, and treats uncertainty as a flaw. But it is necessary to stay in touch with that deep, living half of ourselves that doesn't strive for perfection but for authenticity. Breaking without guilt is a gift I give myself. It is the space I hold for what is unsettled, for what dissolves the image to reshape me, for what awakens, and for the first time says aloud, I am, no matter how, not because it's necessary, but because it's time. If I now break, cry, secularize, then I have not failed. I am human, I am real, and I am dangerously lovable. For no one is as lovable as the person who has not only stopped doing, but started feeling. Chapter 18. Relearning to exist without armor. It took so long until I realized what the armor did to me. It protected me, yes, but it also imprisoned me. Every smile, every perfect reaction, every phrase I weighed carefully was a piece of metal plating that separated me from my own sensations. I had grown so accustomed to being controlled, conforming, and resilient that I no longer knew what real breathing felt like, what softness felt like, what aliveness felt like. It was as if I had completely forgotten how to be an unprotected version of myself. I remember the day I noticed how heavily I still carried that protection. I just returned from shopping, carrying 2 bags, my arms trembling slightly, and instead of giving myself a moment's rest, I kept going. I emptied, I refilled, I washed, I wiped, I organized. My body switched into autopilot because thinking took priority. Only when I heard my own breath, loud, uneven, unprotected, did I feel, this is my body. This is me. And I felt foreign in myself. Since that day, I began to allow small cracks in my armor. I started to see pauses not as a luxury, but as a commandment. I began to let sounds be louder, the beating of my heart, the scratching of my thoughts, the burning in my back. I practiced not covering up these signals, but accepting them. I began to feel what it's like to be unprotected, not out of exhibitionism, but out of honesty. It was a quiet process. I developed a new inner language, a language without judgment, without expectation, a language that asks me, how do you really feel right now? And I answered with gentle words, with honest posture, sometimes with exhaustion, sometimes with emptiness, sometimes with relief. And each time I felt something in me soften, not vulnerable, but ready. That readiness was an invitation to others, and to myself. It asked, shall we see each other without armor too? I noticed how rare that was, how unfamiliar, how unsettling. I began to be perceived more slowly, not as efficient, but as human. And I realized I had stolen time for myself, for living, for feeling, for the small movements that happen between words. I observed myself in the mirror, unstaged, not perfect, not likable, just me, with my scars, with my fatigue as aliveness, as permission to be infinite in my being. And yes, that felt liberating. Not easy, not without shadows, but real. And I didn't want to miss it anymore. The return to softness brought other resources, closeness, trust, true encounter. Not because I opened up, but because there were people who could bear it, who saw that it was no game, who sensed that being unprotected brings forth something living, something powerful because it arises from wholeness. And so I learned to dwell without armor. In my everyday life, in my encounters, in my pauses, I inhabited my own body, explored my breathing spaces, tested my limits. I breathed in, I breathed out, and felt presence. Not because I defended myself, but because I now let myself be seen. That doesn't always make me happy, but it makes me real. And I have stopped explaining every pleasure immediately, justifying every need at once, judging every pause as a deficiency. I grant myself space for mistakes, for pain, for boredom, for joy. And that space is full of aliveness, because it isn't forced, but permitted. I exist without armor, not for the world, but for myself. Chapter 19. I don't want to be strong. I want to be real. For a long time, I lost myself in the mirror of expectations, thinking that strength was the highest goal, that as a woman one must manage, remain unshakable, never break down, never doubt. Yet over time I realized that that image does not suit me, that it shapes me but does not nourish me, that it protects but also seals me off. And eventually it became clear to me. I don't want to be strong. I want to be real. Being real means not acting according to what is expected of me, but according to what moves within me. It means not functioning at any cost, but feeling in inner alignment. It means not being present on command, but showing up at my own pace. It means making decisions not weighed by the value others assign them, but by what they mean to me. The turning point came one evening when I was alone, exhausted, without many words. I lay in bed, the cover pulled up to my chin, and instead of diving into thoughts or functioning, I listened to myself. I heard the silence in me, the pulse of the night, the beat at my back. I felt that I did not know this silence, that it did not calm me but awakened me. I placed my hand on my heart and felt that this beating was not a signal to control, but a return to myself. I still remember thinking that night, enough. I no longer want to be the image of an unshakable woman. Not because I dislike resilience, but because I no longer want to live this life. Loud, controlled, sovereign, instead of sensitive, restless, alive. And in that moment, I began to choose myself anew, not as the heroine of the same old film, but as a person in development. To be real meant first to endure my own contradictions. The days when I performed miracles, and those when I could hardly lift myself. The phases when I was loud, and those when I worked on myself in silence. It meant raising my voice but also holding space for my quiet. It meant sometimes abandoning plans because they no longer suited me, and all without guilt, but with respect for my chaos, my ups and downs, my malaise and my strength. It also meant cloaking myself in truth, not in armor. I began to reach out not only to people, but to let them in. I allowed myself to be touched, to become emotional, without retreating behind a facade. And something surprising happened. The world stood still. My worth in it changed little. It was not tied to my performance. And the relationships in which I showed myself with all that I was became deeper, quieter, more real. I noticed how liberating it is to make decisions without prematurely explaining them, to change plans without justifying myself, to show feelings without betraying the image of solidity I once held. And I noticed how strong I became because of it. Not stronger than before, but stronger because I stopped denying myself, because I felt what is, not what should be. Being real also means taking responsibility for one's own life, not as a burden, but as a statement in my own handwriting. Responsibility is not only achievement, but also care, for me and for those around me. I set boundaries, not as defense, but as protection, not to close myself off, but to show myself consciously. I chose spaces where I don't have to prove myself, but may breathe. It was and is not an easy path. It demands constant attention, a sensitive ear to the voice that says, "Keep going," against the other voice that whispers, "That was enough." I still stand in large parts of this expectation society where strength is sold, control is applauded, and yet I know now I can stand outside as long as I breathe inside. I can say no without justifying myself. I can cry without hiding. I can be quiet without losing meaning. I will not reject everything outright. I will not fundamentally oppose strength. It has enabled me in many ways. But I have learned why I want to be strong, not to meet expectations, but to act from wholeness, not to be seen, but to learn to see myself, not to shine, but to glow, quietly, but truly. And today, when I look back at life before this decision, I see less a path and more a camp. Beautiful, impressive, but confining. And now I pitch my tent on wider terrain. No longer heroic, but honest. No longer perfect, but human. No longer incessantly in motion, but at least in harmony with my inner rhythm. I let go of having to appear strong, so that I may begin to be human, with all contradictions, all feelings, all imperfections, and to appreciate them anew instead of denying them. Because true strength does not lie in enduring at any cost, but in resting in one's own truth. And I am determined. I don't want to be strong. I want to be real, and that is enough. Finally. Chapter 20. I have decided to stop pretending. On a clear afternoon, when sunlight streamed through the half-drawn curtain and dust motes danced in the air, I asked myself the same question that had quietly accompanied me on many occasions. For whom have I actually reshaped myself so much? No answer came immediately. but something inside me reacted unmistakably. Something demanded clarity, called for awakening. Not a loud impulse, but an inner flow that told me, enough. And not because I was surprised or struck, but because I was exhausted from all the play that nobody wanted to see anymore. From all the masks that had muffled my voice, disrupted my rhythm, redirected my strength. I no longer know precisely when the decision matured. I can only describe it as if my entire life had gathered all the quiet, honest voices within me to later clarify something together. Now I will no longer pretend everything is under control. Not loud or dramatic, more like an inner exhale, a conscious opening of the eyes, a release of the sleek performance. In that moment, I was allowed to take my form again. Not the one others expected, but my own. That resolve did not strike me suddenly. It began with observations so ordinary that I barely noticed them. The considered smile that no longer lit up. The answer that faltered within me because it no longer resonated. The posture I consciously maintained even as I was dissolving. I looked in the mirror and recognized a face I no longer knew. A face that until then had not dared itself to me. And in that instant it became clear that I had stopped living. Instead, I had already been functioning. And functioning had nothing to do with living. I began to leave spaces where I constantly had to profit from being in control. Conversations in which I always played the strong one. Situations in which I hid my insecurity under the guise of supposed competence. I knew. I don't want this anymore. Not out of restraint, but out of longing. Longing for an encounter in which I may show real weakness. Longing for honesty instead of good humor for others. And I dared, quietly. I said when I felt weak. I spoke the truth about my tiredness, my confusion, my doubts. Sometimes I asked to be held, without question, without advice. I learned to enter spaces without first unpacking the version of myself that can function well. I simply stepped in and stayed. Even when the voice in my head said, "You look unprofessional. It seems disorganized. You harm your image." I felt that it had nothing to do with my worth. That imperfection is an access, not to loss, but to authenticity. I also lost. Some people drifted away. Not out of malice, but because they didn't know how to handle my being in blur. It wasn't a drama, but a shift, a change in the tonal fabric of my life. Yet what really struck me, I gained. People with whom I spoke more deeply, without backup. Encounters that were quieter but full of resonance. Connections not based on showmanship, but on shared humanity. I learned that honesty does not betray, it connects. That weakness does not weaken, it humanizes. That one does not break when showing fragility, but rather, perhaps more quietly, but clearly, reunites in the community of what truly sustains us. In this chapter, I allowed myself to look back 100 times at the stories in which I betrayed myself because I thought I had to be so different. At the phases in which I dressed myself up even though there was nothing inside. At the 7 resilience poses with which I kept myself in cover. And I relinquished all of that. Not because it was wrong, but because I wanted to allow myself something different. Because I wanted life, not facade. I don't want to say I'm perfect. That would miss the point. I am crooked, inconsistent, imperfect, and that is good. Because I stop having to be anything else. I celebrate that my chaos and my progress can stand side by side. That sometimes I'm proud of what I achieve, and sometimes I hold myself when I must fall. And that is entirely allowed. I live in the tension between both. And that feels real. When I wrote this, or rather whispered it, when I began to listen to myself, no one was there but me. No spectators, No audience, no judges. It was quiet. But inside it was loud. Loud for freedom, loud for pain, loud for rebirth. And I said to myself, beautiful that you stay. Beautiful that you are finally real. And that sentence carried not the glowing burden of a goal, but the gentle blanket on which my entire being rests. I have decided. I no longer deceive myself. I have stopped bending myself to please, and I begin anew every day. Because truthfulness is not a state, but a breath I consciously give myself. And that is enough, for today, and for tomorrow, and perhaps for a lifetime if I let it continue to breathe, not as a facade, but as authenticity. Thank you for journeying with me this far. If this audiobook has touched you, made you reflect, or simply allowed you to exhale for a moment, then it was worth it. If you'd like to share such honest thoughts further with me, feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Tell me which part moved you, what resonates within you, or when you decided for yourself to no longer have to be strong, but simply yourself. I'll hear you in the next chapter. Until then, stay real, not perfect.